This episode of Historians of the Movies podcast is brought to you by you. Thank you to our new Patreon.com subscribers, Bridget Donahue Farrell and Ariella Archer. If you would like to help support the pod, you can do so by going to patreon.com/historians at the movies. Now on with the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to Historians of the Movies podcast. I'm your host and creator, Jason Herbert, and every single week we are talking about movies and the histories behind them. And this week is special because it's our 100th episode. Guys, we made it. Almost 2 years ago, we launched HATM, and we've been going ever since. So this week, I wanted to do something special for you. And I wanted to talk about ancient Egypt. We're talking about Stargate. And you're going to see why this episode is special in just a second. I brought on for you two amazing scholars. First and foremost is my dear friend, Julia Troche. She's been on the pod before. You know her. She is an associate professor at Missouri State University. She's an Egyptologist by training. And she brought on for us Stuart Tyson Smith. Now, Stuart is also a professor of Egyptology over at the University of California, Santa Barbara. But that's not the end of Stuart's story. Stuart is also the historical consultant on Stargate. So we're going to hear in this episode today about Stuart's expertise, about ancient Egypt, about aliens, because God knows you can't conflate the two. But we're going to hear what it was like to make this film, about Stuart's engagement with, say, James Spader and Kurt Russell, and what it was like to make this film, and why Stargate might be the most historically accurate Egyptian film ever made. So, guys, this is a fun conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Sit back and relax, because Stargate is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. A long time ago, I would do, or not a long time ago, but like we would do this thing where we're like, all right, everybody ready? And kind of give them the so forth. And then what would happen is we would talk for like 10, 15 minutes beforehand. And that's when you get all the juicy bits of people like hanging out.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have to tell you, I feel so good / bad. I feel like like we're cheating on Kate right now.
I know, a little bit. But you had her on Aliens, so it's only fair that I get to go on an extra show as well.
Yeah, no, of course, right? And like we're doing the Aliens. Did you listen to that pod?
Mm-hmm.
Like I was like, why are you guys on? And I was like, I needed a sure thing,
I messaged Kate that I yelled at her through the podcast so many times, because sometimes Kate and I are, Kate Shepard, right? Yeah. Sometimes we are like so similar, so the same people. And then listening to her on there, and she was like, we don't need to watch horror previews. I don't need to see smile previews. And I'm like, you can't be more wrong. Horror is the best genre. And then she was like, and who was it? Like, she was like, is Data the bad guy? And she just, it just was, she cracked me up that whole episode.
No, she's great. And I have to tell you, like our other partner in crime, Leah messaged me the other day. Did I tell you about this?
Mm-mm.
Leah, if you're listening, I'm telling you right now. So Leah messages me the other day on like Instagram, and she's like, Dr. Herbert, I have a question. And I'm like, Leah, who are you talking to? Right? I'm like, because she's so respectful and trained and doesn't want to take anything for granted. Meanwhile, when we did our pod, when it was me and Julia and Kate and Leah, like Leah was the only one not drinking because she was behaving and like showing respect. Meanwhile, the three of us were just like the whole time. So, but I'm like, Leah, don't ever, ever, ever call me Dr. Herbert ever again. And I don't want to take it lightly, because there is a thing, where we're like women have to fight to be called doctor. So I keep like the doctor thing in my handle on like social media, which Julia, you don't have. I went trying to tag her the other day on like Blue Sky. Like, what the? So anyway, Stuart, were you playing Outlaws today? You'd mentioned that
yesterday. So I got early access, and then I played it for an hour or so before I was too tired, especially for a new game.
Early impressions?
The world is amazing. So if you're into Star Wars, which, I remember seeing the first one when I was actually in high school, which tells you how
TIE fighter over there, yeah.
But it was like mind blowing. So, so the atmosphere and everything, like, going through the streets of the city, and it's got all the touches. So, still trying to figure out the game mechanics. But
no,
I just watch. I don't have the time anymore, I feel like, to dedicate to like these like world exploring kind of games, and so I just end up watching summaries on like Twitch and YouTube.
Yeah.
So I can feel like I can still like experience the storyline, but just sped up 2 times speed.
Well, you know what? Like I've always thought, like, when it comes to Star Wars, they in a lot of ways have done better storytelling in the video games than they have in the films themselves. And I'm obviously going to point to Knights of the Old Republic, right, which has been phenomenal. And you can just watch the cutscenes. Like that, you can get on YouTube and just watch and go all the way through. I'll sit there for like 20 minutes and just like, the whole time. And I've got my 12-year-old playing Knights of the Old Republic now. And for that's an older game for us, but for him, it's like, what is this? I'm like, welcome. My 16-year-old, mind you, is taking world history right now, and he's studying the Byzantine Empire. So he's playing Civilization tonight as the Byzantines. And my ex-wife is just like, see what we've done? I'm like, yeah. So, I'm enjoying that. So
there you go. Well, you have to play Assassin's Creed Origins then, if you haven't. Because it is, it is really good.
Really, really good.
Yeah. Well, to the point where people are using it to teach. It's that. Plus, it's a great game. But
we actually want to do some video games on the pod at some point in time. So I may beg you to come back on.
Oh, sure.
Julia, you want to announce like what our grand plans are? We're taking us on the road at some point. We're going to do this.
So in our last video, we realized that there is a shared love amongst many of us for Disney. And my goal is to now do a live recording of this show from Disney, writing the rides that are inspired by the movies, talking about the representations of the rides and different sort of mythologies in these rides. But then also that's in Disneyland. And then in Disney World, doing just a drinking around Epcot. Because why not?
That's where I worked.
Yeah. So you have this history there. And then just thinking about, as a historian, looking at all of these different microcosms of, different countries. And then now you have things like the Guardians ride there and sort of the transition, the movement from this cultural, historical Walt Disney, microcosm of what he thinks, the world should be. I just think that'd be a really fun place to walk around, drink around the world, and talk about your history at Disney and, critique.
We need a videographer to go with us.
We need a videographer. We need a vlogger.
We need funding.
We need a sponsor.
If you're listening right now, we could really use right now as income. People are like, the other night we were doing, I was kind of a jerk. Like, so Stuart, we've been doing this watch party for HATM for like 6 years now. And one of my lifelong friends, I've known him since literally we were 9 years old, and he's been part of it and stuff like that. HATM, he's a wonderful guy, absolute sweetheart. His name's Drew Harrell. And he's messaging me. He's like, well, we should do longer films like on Sunday nights. And I'm like, God damn it, Drew, I'm just too damn tired. I'm not making any money off of this right now. And I kind of bit his head off and I felt bad. But I'm also like, Drew's known me for 40 years. He's probably used to this at some point in time. But yeah, but no, we
making money. I mentioned to a friend, my friend Chelsea Davis, who's a historian of wine. I think I actually mentioned her to you before, Stuart. She studies wine, not in antiquity, but in the British Empire, right? And looks at South Africa and Australia as
I have ideas.
So she would love to be on this. And I mentioned I was doing this podcast, and I was like, I'm doing this podcast, so I have to leave to go record. She said, what are you doing? I said, historians at the movie. She's like, oh, I follow them.
Oh, well, if she's listening right now,
you're known, you're a popular entity. We need to, find ways to get those delicious dollars so we can go drink around the world.
Thank you. Right. And so forth. So I've been waiting to do Sideways, and I've got someone lined up, but I really need a second guest to bounce ideas off of. Yes, please.
Well, it's right in my backyard.
I noticed this. Yeah. I was looking at your Vita today, and usually I don't do that because like we keep such a low bar. around here. I'm just like, anybody can come on.
Yeah.
I don't care. And then,
I thought this
I
was
did
an
notice.
expensive vetting process, and that's why I got on.
When I actually live north of Santa Barbara, so I'm like, I don't know, 10 minutes away from the tasting room vineyard that they used, and they actually filmed in a little town called Los Alamos, and they actually filmed it in the town and in the vineyards around.
I'm on my way.
So
let's go.
You guys should come out and visit. You know,
next time, if we do a recording on our Disney trip, we can stop off in Santa Barbara and record Santa Barbara first.
Yeah.
No, we're gonna do swingers. It's like, okay, so the way this all came together was like, Kate was like, you would do Indiana Jones with 3 women? I was like, yeah, so we'll just do all these classic guy films, only it's just me and Julia and Kate. And so forth. So, that's just totally how we'll it's totally how we'll roll. So no, so now I have the soundtrack to Sideways in my head as you're telling me this. So people are like, really? We're 10 minutes in. You haven't introduced anybody. What movie you're talking about? Like they see Stargate on the sign. We all watched it. I watched it again this morning. This was a film I know so well. I didn't feel like I actually had to watch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
but then I did again anyway.
I did too.
I
did too last night when you messaged we're going to record tonight, and I was like, uh-oh.
Yeah, I was okay. So here's the background. I have like one sent like email, and then I just copy and paste to everybody, and then I just change up the words.
Right.
And so I left the today versus tomorrow on for it. So that's why you guys were panic
kept
mode.
Me on my toes. I had heart palpitations are needed.
That's I had the same reaction.
I'm glad.
Okay.
Exactly. So, well, hell, let's just jump into this then. So, we're talking Stargate tonight, and this is such a fun movie, guys. I remember when we first kicked off HATM like 6 years ago. It immediately fits into that fun play with history, not take itself too seriously vibe. And I think that we all are kind of drawn to, right? I mean, this is just like, it's a movie we just like. You can watch it, you can sit back, kick back, not think too heavily, just enjoy it. So when we kick it around, Julia was like, I want to start. You just dibbed it like right away. And then you were like, I'm bringing on my friend. I was like, okay. So that was the vetting process. Where
I was like, you cannot do a podcast about Stargate without Stuart Tyson Smith.
Well, Stuart Tyson Smith, you're here now. You belong to the fold. Welcome. Welcome to
You're welcome, and I'm sorry.
Thanks for the invite. No, it's fine.
You're ours now. So, well, speaking of which, since Julia is drinking right now, Stuart, do you want to introduce yourself?
So I'm Stuart Tyson Smith. I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And I am trained both as an Egyptologist and an anthropological archaeologist. So I guess I'm an Egyptologist and anthropologist, but I'm also a Nubiologist. So one of a small group of people who study ancient Nubia, which is kind of the southern part of Egypt and northern part of Sudan. And for many years, I've had an excavation in Sudan. I kind of started off in Egypt and gradually drifted farther south. Got interested in things like empires and intercultural interactions, and a little bit now the sort of racism that often pervades our field, and sort of trying to counter that, and the way Nubians have always been sort of marginalized, and trying to bring them into the forefront as a really wonderful African civilization. And I'll just make one little comment about Sudan. It is in the throes of a vicious civil war right now, and it's one that's not getting a proper media attention. It's not getting enough, funding. We have credible reports that the National Museum in Khartoum, which is now lays in ruins, a capital city of 20 million, and the National Museum was robbed. And so it's a very serious situation. If anyone is interested in learning more about the cultural heritage side of it, there's a great organization that I helped found called AMSARC, AMSARC.org, that you can go and you can. They have lectures really trying to promote Sudanese scholars and support them. There are a bunch of them that have fled to the north of Sudan, which is still relatively stable, which is where a lot of the antiquities are. And we're trying to keep things going, but also think about donating to groups like Médecins Sans Frontières and CARE and so on that are operating in those areas too. Of course, they're also operating in Gaza and other places. But it's just the crisis itself is just astonishing. And it's really sad for me, having spent so much time in the country. And the people are just, really wonderful, except, of course, the bad actors that are fighting now. But it's really a great tragedy. So on the upside, though, I'm actually talking with an Egyptian colleague about joining an Egyptian American project in Luxor, still looking at Kushites. But instead of looking at Egyptians in Nubia, in Sudan, in Kush, ancient Kush, I'm going to look at Kushites in Egypt. So that should be nice.
I feel stunningly just like I have not done enough with my life at this point in time. Like, you just rattled that off, and I'm like, I sir have a podcast. Yeah. So,
but if you want something more obscure, when I was in high school, I was in this awesome jazz choir, and we were the first jazz choir to perform at the Montreux International Jazz Festival in Switzerland. And
so cool.
Where are you from originally?
From Los Angeles area, a suburb called Palos Verdes. And
yeah, absolutely.
We had this amazing music instructor, and he got us to this place. And so I met Ella Fitzgerald. I mean, just to say, I am unworthy, you are wonderful. but still, I met her, which is pretty amazing. And all the greats were there: Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, Oscar Peterson, Dave Brubeck. It was just an incredible experience. And my wife was along for it too, which was nice. So we met in high school and got married. So there's a little personal information.
Follow that, Julia.
No. You always set me up like this. You needed me to go first so we can set the bar low, and then,
that's my move.
Yeah, that's what we need to do next time. Julia Troche, I teach at Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri. I also have sort of my Heimat, my home of origin is San Diego and Los Angeles. So we have that same sort of SoCal spirit. I share that with Stuart. And I went to UCLA for my undergrad. Yeah. So I love.
And that's where I got my PhD. So we have that.
I have an LA thing too, actually.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, I've only been to Los Angeles like twice, but if you look over, I have many fine books over here. I call them my fun books that I read. And here's my I'm working on my book like right now, is like plotting out my stuff and so forth. It's like, oh shit, I have to write this thing. But I have this whole other series of history books I read just because I like just to read other types of history. Yeah. And I really love post-war Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. That's like my jam. Like, I love reading LA. So when I walk around Disney's Hollywood Studios and I see the street signs, I'm like, I know where this is, and so forth, right? So like Natalia Molina is a place that the Nayarit and so forth, stuff like that. Like, it's just like, I love. And also LA Confidential is like my number 5 favorite film of all. That's a movie we have to do on this pod.
Yeah.
So
that's a good one.
Yeah. And Kate can't come because she hasn't been there. I don't know. Is this our Beat Up Kate podcast?
I think so. I'm so sorry, Kate. We love you.
Do we? Okay, I guess so. I was messaging her this morning.
It's just that she's so impressive. We have to we have
it's
to build
our up with somehow. Her. I know. And there are parts of this, like watching this film, like, oh man, sorry, Kate, you're not a part of this pod. Yeah. All right, let's talk.
I have some. I'm going to do some callbacks.
Okay.
So folks have to go listen to Raiders before they, pause this, come back, listen to Raiders, and then, because I have some callbacks.
And then go listen to our Temple pod, which is coming in a few months.
Oh, yeah.
Because we're doing that. Sure. We're doing that. All right, let's jump in here. I was just waxing poetic about how much I love this film, but and Stuart, maybe this is, I guess, you want to spill the beans on your relationship to this film as well, like.
Oh yeah,
like it's hard to ask you your general impressions of this movie since you have a relationship. But go on.
I'm obviously somewhat biased, but as I mentioned in our little chit chat before we officially started, Stargate is important to me both as it's sort of the first thing I did after I got my PhD, which was wonderful on a number of levels. I mean, first of all,
Right.
Having grown up in LA, Hollywood was right there, and I love watching film and so on. So being involved on a movie was incredible. I got paid, which, as all academics know, is yeah, exactly, no guarantee. So that helped me,
right,
in the gap between getting a real job and that. But then also everybody called me Dr. Smith, which we were just talking about doctor, and that that was very validating. So it's kind of nice. But the other thing about it was, I mean, there was a moment when I thought, well, do I want to own up to this and like have a film credit? I waffled a little bit until I started working on the film, and I realized they were really serious about the Egyptology, and especially about the language, which happened to be something that worked really well for me, just in my background in Egyptology. Maybe we can talk about that later. And so it quickly became apparent that it would turn out well. And also reading through the script, the way that Egyptology is really fronted in the script, which in a really dynamic way, and the language itself kind of drives the plot for like 2/3 of the film, which is really cool. And the Egyptologist character is central to it. And working with James Spader too, great actor, wonderful person to work with, and really serious about the role too. So I worked with him not only on like the dialogue and other stuff, but I worked with him on his character. And so he asked me, "What's it like to be an out of work Egyptologist?" Which I could tell him because that's what it was. And so I right from the get go, I knew it was going to be good. So I said, "Oh yeah, give me the credit." So I now have 3 major motion picture credits with Stargate, The Mummy, and The Mummy Returns. The Mummy movie's not as great Egyptologically, but Stargate also I knew it was something special. So I'm also a big fan of science fiction, and the conceit and the way they followed it out, I thought was really interesting. But also they were very much dedicated to this idea of the suspension of disbelief. And I think that's one of the reasons why the movie works so well, is that it's really good science fiction. And Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin, the director and the writer-producer, were both very much into the genre of science fiction. And that was very much their idea of the film, was to make sure that it was a good science fiction film. And I think they accomplished that. And I'm very pleased with the way it turned out. I mean, went to the premiere, which was pretty cool too, and the party afterwards, which was also really cool. I was really involved with the film. I was on the set of the film probably 3 months out of the 5-month shoot. So basically, anytime there was substantive Egyptological content or especially dialogue, I was there. So I really got to experience the set, the life on the set. So as an anthropologist, that was really interesting. So it was like another culture, really. I often refer to it as kind of like, being a stranger in a strange land, the Heinlein novel, because I was sort of this strange person coming from a different world in this other world. And we were sort of both encountering one another, and it was really a fascinating experience. But also, to give Roland credit, he ran a really nice set. So respectful, he was really loyal to his people, and you could tell that. And they were always very respectful, and to me, and took me seriously, and wanted me to do a good job. I mean, it wasn't that they tolerated me, but they actually encouraged me to go up to the actors and correct their pronunciation and do things like this. I'm sure the actors occasionally got annoyed with that. But so all in all, with all that experience, and I think the film turned out really well, and it stands up to the test of time. I didn't watch it this time again, but I watched it many times.
I think we're gonna give you a pass on that one.
Yeah. And so, but every time I watch it, I still think this is, it's a great movie. It turns, and the way they did the special effects, they limited the use of CGI, and that was for 2 reasons. One, at that point, it was very expensive, and the technology was limited. But it was also, again, part of their ethos, because they realized that physical effects, and it's kind of like the new Star Wars series are rediscovering this, right? Physical effects are much more convincing than CGI, because there's always that uncanny quality of CGI, right? And so, it's like the Baby Yoda, if you will, versus the CGI Yoda versus the Muppet Yoda, basically, from the original film. And it's the puppets that are actually more convincing, for me anyway, than the CGI, which just looks kind of fake to me. So anyway, all in all,
Jumping CGI
I'm very
Yoda.
happy with the results, and I'm very happy to own up to it. My role in the film. And of course, what I actually contributed something substantial to the film, which also was gratifying. And it's certainly a much better film as a film, but also the Egyptological content is solid, which is partly their instincts. I have to say, they and the other members of the crew, like art department and so on, props, did a really excellent job. They had good instincts. And you can see a lot of touches, which I'm not sure even they really appreciated, but their aesthetic was just spot on. And I'll give you one example of that. One of my favorite things from the film is the costume that Jay Davidson playing, the sun god Ray, where it has the Hathor horns and the sun disk behind his neck.
Sure.
And you think, well, that can't be right because Ra is a male god, and Hathor is a goddess, but no. It turns out Ra is really androgynous, which makes the casting of Jay Davidson actually a brilliant move.
Especially coming off the Crying Game, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that was a major reason why they decided.
And considering the $1 million paycheck.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I worked with Jay a lot because he had a lot of dialogue, and he struggled because he wasn't trained as an actor, and he hated it. And I talked with him a lot about this, and he said, "Oh yeah, I wouldn't have done it, but they offered me $1 million. So what am I going to do? Say no?" So of course
the story goes right that he didn't really feel like doing it again, doing another movie, and he suggested, all right, if you give me $1 million, I'll do it, thinking that he'd call the bluff, and they're like, all right, we'll give you the $1 million.
Shit.
How do you say no to $1 million?
Yeah, exactly.
Listen. The list of shit I would do for $1 million, right? Just inquire below. It's fine. Julia, you come to this film from a different angle, from a different light. Do you remember your first time seeing this movie?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I was a kid of 90s action films. So loved watching 90s action films, probably way too young to be watching those movies. I was born in 86. But I had a brother who was born in 82. So I feel like when he was watching stuff, I was watching it as well, and watched way too many things way too young. But that then instilled in me this love of just that 90s action. And so Kurt Russell, watched everything Kurt Russell has ever done, and this was definitely one of those movies that I probably watched. I didn't watch it. I can't remember watching it in theater, but I definitely remember watching it on VHS, renting it and watching it at home with my brother. And then I kind of forgot about it. And in college, when I was studying Egyptology, it kind of came back again, and I became fully obsessed. And I loved the show. I have to say I'm probably a bigger fan of the show than I am the movie, just because there's 10 seasons.
We can talk about the show. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I
by all means, go for it. Yeah. If you want to go into it. But
I love the show. And I love Richard Dean Anderson, and, he's no Kurt Russell in terms of action stardom, but as a TV actor is one of the top for me, and I think he plays such an amazing O'Neill with 2 L's character. So I love the show. And for the longest time, up until about 4 years ago, my Gmail icon was actually Daniel Jackson. And that was my icon on Gmail. And anytime I had to have a pen name, I would do Daniel Jackson. That would be my pen name for everything. So I eventually changed it just because I was ruminating a little bit on how that could be potentially misinterpreted by people. And I just, so I ended up changing it. But I also am sending you right now an email because I can't figure out how to send an image through our platform. But I excavated, and I think I told you, I excavated in Abydos, and I wore this special hat when I was there. And it was the Stargate echelon for Earth, the Earth symbol. It was a patch that I then sewed onto a hat and wore through my first excavation ever in Abydos. I wore that every day on site. I don't think anybody got it. but I
That is subtle. Oh, I got to show you something with the hat.
please do. Yeah, this is all about the props. I can't find the hat. We looked for it, but I think it's long gone.
Well, HATM was founded on National Treasure, the old adage being we get Nick Cage, right? And archaeologists get Harrison Ford. So I'm kind of wondering, guys, look at you.
That's so cool. So cool. Mine did not have film crew on it.
Yeah.
I just got the most amazing piece actually of film history for myself for my birthday. My ex-wife bought me a vintage film poster from 1964 for a film called Ride the Wild Surf. It's super niche kind of thing. And then it cost me a whole bunch of money to frame it. I was like, what the heck? So forth. But yeah, that Stuart is that's going to take the cake on most anybody's film, film crew on there.
Yeah.
So
we're good. I mean, again, sorry, Kate, but Kate has a lot of memorabilia that she brings onto this show. But I think the hat with film crew is going to never be topped.
She was just sending me stuff the other day, texting me. She's like, you should buy this. I was like, okay, I guess. But this is my question. So is Daniel Jackson, does he become like the guy? Is he the Egyptologist for Egypt who is there a person, a big screen person for Egyptologists?
I mean, I think Indiana Jones, who's not traditionally an Egyptologist necessarily, it's not like, but I still think Indiana Jones takes the cake for that one, right? Because I mean, as much as I love Stargate, it is not nearly as present, right? It's not nearly as students, kids, whatever, just aren't as aware of Stargate as they are something like Indiana Jones or Raiders, and so I think it's just, but for those of us who are in Egyptology, I can say everybody at UCLA, we watched that movie and all of us were like, Daniel Jackson is the best, we just fell in love with this, like, every night that we were in the academic building in the middle of campus, working at 9 p.m. on a Friday, like translating stuff, sometimes like we would make those jokes. We would be like, it took you how many years to translate this, and like, but that was like, it's like this uber nerd vibe, now, of course, none of us, to be clear, actually believe that aliens built the pyramids, but we love the Daniel Jackson nerd sort of Egyptology, like just really living in the language. And I have to say, when I watched this, one of the reasons I fell in love with it was because of the good Egyptology. And it wasn't until many years later that I met Stuart and was able to fangirl and be like, I love all the things in this movie. So it really, though, I think because it does Egyptology so good, it does. I mean, just cool. The comments, the jokes, like the hieroglyphs, perfect, right? Like you can actually read the hieroglyphs when he's like, this isn't Stargate, Sevaldua, like, or this wasn't a gate of heaven at Stargate. Like these all make sense.
That's
like,
such a boss scene when he just comes in and takes a piece of chalk and just like, no. And Richard Kind is just right there, just with his mouth open and stuff. And he does his great. I love Richard Kind as an actor. He's so great. And he does that wonderful job kind of playing that off of James Spader, where he's like, you're. I wrote. I did it.
What did you translate this, Budge?
Yeah.
I can't believe they keep printing copies of that.
And that's my line. I wrote that scene. So
you did.
Yeah, you would ask what's your favorite line in the film, and definitely in English.
The one you wrote?
That's definitely the favorite line. And I was so pleased that it made it into the film because you never know what's going to make it in and what's going to get left on the cutting room floor. I was actually there that day. Those are the hieroglyphs that are on the chalkboard, or me. I drew all those on, and
for real.
And I was there, and was coaching Spader, and he said, "Oh, I don't know. This sounds awkward. I don't know if I can really say this. Maybe we should just cut this line." I was like, "No," but then he said, "No, I'll do it," and he ran through it, did it beautifully, made it into the film. And it's great. And the best thing was the University of Chicago. It used to be called the Oriental Institute. Now it's the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. But anyway, they ran a blog, not a blog, like a listserv. This is back in the day. And the listserv kind of blew up when Stargate came out. because I wasn't as well known at that point, and who's this Stuart Smith guy? And they're really speaking ancient Egyptian. Wow, that's mind blowing. And one person got on and said, "Oh, that comment about Bud, should I not be using his books to translate?" This way, yes.
This whole ensemble here is going to start to develop a real fan group here, because I got so many comments when we did the Raiders pod about some people were going, because Julia, you and Kate and Leah started talking about the stuff that Indy was teaching and how that was dated at the time, and people just died over this when they were listening to this pod. So Stuart, like, to hear that, and of course I'm not an Egyptologist, I study indigenous Florida in the 17th century. I love knowing that this is like legit Egyptology, right? It's just a little joy of this, and I think for a lot of people, at least myself, when I first became stirred by history when I was I don't know, 7th grade or something. Like a lot of people, it was Egypt, it was Greece, right? I think those are some of those places that hook you as a young person, and then kind of it manifests later on into different things,
Most people grow out of it. Some of us don't.
Yeah.
Some of us, it really becomes this lifelong love affair with the past and telling stories, I think, in so many different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the success of just one comment on the character that, Daniel Jackson, that James Spader helped, created with a bit of help from me. I think someone commented, I would love to find the issue of, I think it was Archaeology magazine, where they reviewed the film, and they commented, this is one of the most convincing portrayals of an academic in film, which is true. I mean, when you look at the Mummy movies and the characters there, and Indiana Jones, none of them are realistic, like real academics. But James Spader's Daniel Jackson is very much an academic, and I think that's one of the reasons why it appeals to Egyptologists and other academics, is you can see yourself in it and you can relate. But also it's impressive that Hollywood went that way instead of
I had one question on that,
type, but they wanted him to be that way, and yet he drives the plot. Kurt Russell is the big action guy, and probably the big name, but Spader really comes in and has a dynamic role in driving the plot forward, which is really cool.
No, this is always this in this series is maybe a little different, but I always felt like this film, of course, Russell, you needed to have the name to help drive the film, right, and sell the film and stuff like that. And Russell, I think, is maybe 1B in this role, but this is Daniel Jackson's movie.
Yeah.
I mean, there's you're talking about a love with this film, Julia. Also, for me, it was with Shaori. I was watching this hi, you're pretty. So because I like this movie. All right, we talked about this being a real history film. I want to jump into maybe some popular misconceptions about Egyptian history. I'm sure you guys have to deal with in your own lines of work, scholarship, maybe even with your own students who are coming to your courses with maybe preconceptions about what it is that we do here or what Egypt is and so forth. Can we talk a little bit about just popular or preconceptions or misconceptions of Egyptian history that you often run into on a day-to-day kind of a thing?
I'll start off by saying I'll leave some of the big claims for Stuart to tackle.
Okay.
But I think just thinking about the movie and sort of going sequentially through the movie, and sort of the very beginning presents this 1928, I think, era archaeological project, right? And I think it does, very well in that sort of presentation, right? In the fact that in the 1920s, 30s, and honestly, even working in Abydos in the last decade or so, it's a very sort of hierarchical kind of system. Now, I remember one of the big things, that we did was we got in the trenches with our workers. We were not standing outside, sitting under an umbrella, shouting directions at workers and having them do things. But there still is this very, I give directions to my Gufti or to my Rice, who gives directions to, their men, who gives directions to, it's a very sort of hierarchical system. And there is a lot of moving pieces, and there's a lot of sand being moved, and a lot of, and the ropes sort of pull up the Stargate. All of that is stuff I've seen, in real life. We had this huge in Abydos, we had this entryway into a Roman era or Ptolemaic Roman era hypogeum, a burial place for animal mummies. And there's this giant stone blocking it. And we're like, well, I guess we can't get in. And all of our Egyptian workers were like, we got it. Just give us like 4 pieces of rope and we'll heave it out, and it was like 2 tons. But they were able to, pulley system it out. And I feel like that opening scene really, I think that is kind of the romantic, I guess, maybe image of archaeology. And I think that is actually kind of accurate. What I did not find accurate and what I thought was an interesting parallel to Raiders is Catherine just walking up and stealing a small find off of the small find table. Like there would have been a Rice there who would have had a short stick and would have been like, hey, child, yella, like you are not taking this necklace.
But we need this to drive the plot.
Yeah, I know. And so my thought to Raiders was, I was like, what is it with like young girls going on excavation with their fathers in these stories, just like in Raiders with Marion, again, collecting necklaces, apparently.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, maybe this is like an interesting sort of Marion allusion to like that character of Catherine. But I thought the beginning was, a fairly decent representation of archaeology, especially of the moment. Yeah. And I think that where it started to maybe falter into misconception is once we start seeing the aliens.
Yeah.
and I'll let Stuart take it away from there.
Well, to say one comment on the excavation scene, I actually had a lot to do with that. So I talked to the
I'm not surprised because it was so good.
And they had they were going to make it look like the Indiana Jones excavation at Tanis, which is like really, really bad. Right. I told them, no, none of these like raised platforms and things, because they didn't do that. You have like pits and people go down into it, and suggested all sorts of nice touches and the kind of equipment that people would be using and everything else. But yeah, the kleptomaniac girls is not entirely realistic. So I agree with you on that. But like you said, Jason, it drives the plot in the same way that the space aliens theme drives the plot, right? So
let's just go ahead and do it. Yeah.
I was telling people on set all the time, and that's the glaring historical issue, right? And so I was telling people on the set, of course, all the time that no. But, there's only so much I could do because you wouldn't have a movie without it. And I did think the way that they took that conceit and realized it was really interesting and clever. So because I also like science fiction, I was willing to sort of give it a bit of a pass. The other reason is that there's no pretense that the film is a documentary, unlike a whole bunch of other films, which are, sort of if not docudramas, at least historical settings that you assume have some basis in reality. But this is total science fiction. I mean, who believes that
we're on Earth for the very beginning, but for most of the film, we're not even on our planet. So it looks like our planet. It looks like this ancient Egypt, but it's truly extraterrestrial.
Exactly. And
there's a fantasy aspect there. Yeah,
absolutely. And it gave them a lot of latitude to do different things with costumes, with sets and everything else, which again, I thought they took sort of an Egypt theme and then translated into what would this be if this was a high-tech civilization and so on. So like in a typical film set in ancient Egypt, people are wearing all these colorful outfits. The old Cecil B. DeMille Exodus always comes to mind with that, with these like bright green and really strange colors, which totally didn't exist in ancient Egypt. They wore a lot of white because that's what was practical and it looked nice, and they dressed it up with jewelry. But of course they didn't do that on Stargate, but that's not a problem because space aliens. So they can be as colorful as they want to be. They're not constrained by that. But yet you could see a lot of really neat touches, like the heavies, Ra's enforcers basically wearing the masks. And that's totally ancient Egyptian, right? I mean, priests and other people in rituals and that kind of thing that help reinforce royal power were masking all the time. And so this was a neat sort of nod to that. And that was their instinct to do that. But it totally aligns with what ancient Egyptians actually did. There's that wonderful scene. Also, the sets were amazing. I mean, it was just incredible.
They're some of the largest sets I feel like built at that time, right? Like the temples were just massive.
Yeah, exactly. That temple facade was as big as a place like Kalabsha in Aswan. So Egyptologists will know this, but it's a Roman era temple that is this sort of slightly unfinished look to it, which as that did. And I remember Dean Devlin, when I first arrived out in the desert, they filmed it out in a place called Buttercup Dunes in right on the border with Arizona near Yuma in California. And so I went into, they had this amazing encampment out in the middle of the desert where they had all this going on. They had the different set areas, different filming areas, and all these built up sets. And Dean said, I want to show you something cool. And so he walked me up the sand dune, and I crest the sand dune, and there's this temple buried in the sand. It was so cool. In an article,
you're in a movie set, and he's going to show you something cool.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, I felt like, Belzoni without the bad colonialist part. But I mean, it does take you back to that idea of discovery and these places that, of course, the local people knew what they were, but these European explorers going in and rediscovering these places for at least that European audience. But it really gave you that feel of discovery in a really amazing way. But it was also, I have an article coming out soon. I'll give it a shameless plug in a
plug. We're shameless here anyway.
In a journal, I think it's open access, called Egyptology, and which is all about reception of ancient Egypt and popular culture and so on. And it's a special issue actually on science fiction and Egyptology, which is really awesome. I think, Julia, you have a piece on it?
I think I might have an article coming out on that too.
You too. So,
okay, that's enough shameless plug. Oh, we only have room. Fine.
Mine is about Star Wars.
That's right. But one of the things I bring out in this article is the idea of hyperreality. And I had that. I think the film itself is a nice example of this. So it's a simulation that is so real that you think it's real, right? It becomes real. And that was on the set. That's how I felt. There were moments when I was walking through a set, and even prosaic ones like the missile complex and the underground thing, just, like concrete and, passageways and things. I remember walking through that set and just going, this looks like a real missile silo or something. It was just a set, but it was so real. And even more so for these, like the temple facade one, the street of the village or town on the other planet. Just these amazing set pieces that just immersed you, especially when it's filled with actors acting and then speaking ancient Egyptian. And it was just this amazing sort of experience of hyperreality, of the simulacrum that becomes real for a moment.
And I'll add, just to be the voice of criticism and negativity, right? I want to highlight, I think some people don't realize why it's harmful potentially, right? Like, so I think archaeologists, Egyptologists, like there's folks who are connected with history kind of understands why this idea of like, well, who cares if we think aliens built the pyramids? Like, it's fun, it's silly, it's whatever. And I think like a lot of folks don't realize why that could potentially be harmful. So I just wanted to like throw that out there for the audience. And I think it's the idea that on its most basic level, it is more likely that aliens built this incredible monument than Black Africans who probably lived in this area, right? Or at the very least, whoever did live in this area. And so I think it's this idea, and it really was founded originally in anti-Black racism of the 19th century and 20th century as these histories are being written. And so even though this, has this background in this sort of racist foundation, by no means am I suggesting that everybody who thinks this is fundamentally a racist. Like, I don't think that that's like a one-to-one parallel. And I think a lot of people get excited about these conspiracy theories, and they get excited about science fiction, and they get excited about, but how do we know? Because that is the sort of, Stuart, you mentioned that sort of that discovery, right? And the sort of joy of finding something out and uncovering something that people haven't seen before or that people didn't know was there. And that's a really exciting process. And so I think that's why people like conspiracy theories and like this idea of like, I think I might know something that not everybody else knows. So I don't think people fall into that often with harmful intent. I think a lot of the originators did have harmful intent. But I think it sort of persists, and it has this sort of long foundational kind of origin in really sort of ugly history, in really sort of taking away agency from ancient Egyptians, taking away agency from this African civilization, and trying to place it, if not in Western Europe, well, then at least we'll say that the aliens did it. And this is really then saying that there's no way that these quote unquote backwards people could have done this, because it just was too impossible for these people. And so I think that's really where the harmful part comes in. It's not just in the science fiction aspect or in the sort of joy of, well, how do we know? Like, that is a great question to ask. How do we know? But there's no proof. And I'll also add that there is no proof. There's no evidence that supports aliens, grain silo, any of these other theories, right? Now, we may not always 100% know in history how something came to be, but just because we can't, it's like the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? Like, history, the job isn't to disprove every possible thing. It's just to look at the evidence, and historians go, well, what does this tell us? And as we get new evidence, we'll change our mind and we'll develop our theses, right? And right now, there's nothing there that gives us any credible evidence that says aliens or anybody outside of this region actually built these monuments. And certainly not the pyramids, but, even if we're talking about, Stonehenge or any of these sort of monuments, there's really, really no evidence that extraterrestrials built them.
There's this wonderful Mexican comic that I've heard on Instagram. I keep hearing these clips and things like that. You probably heard it too. He's like, how do you know that Mexicans are good workers? And he's like, we have pyramids in Mexico too. Nobody questions who built them. Right. And it kind of actually plays on its head here when you actually get to the underpinnings of that, which says that whenever you say someone other than Egyptians made these pyramids, you're quite literally taking away from their intellectual labor, their physical labor, the administrative labor of constructing these things.
Yeah, well, and what I say to people is, what is more amazing? The fact that people 2700 BCE were able to figure this out, or that aliens came down and already had it figured out because they were like advanced by 2,000, 3,000 years or whatever. Like, that's not really that incredible. What's more incredible to me, what's more sort of mind-blowing, what gives me more awe in humanity is thinking about how these folks, with their hands and their body weight and their intellect, were able to construct these incredible monuments. And, it's not like they just came up overnight, right? We have failed attempts. And that's what I also love is we have the pyramid, the Bint pyramid, right? That it's like going up at this angle. They realized, oh, this is going to collapse. And then they're like, and so they finished it off. And it's just like this, really different angle. And so we have those attempts where they're like, we think we got it. We don't have it. Yeah. And we have all of that before they get to the great perfect ones that are now standing and that we think of. But we don't think of all the other ones that kind of came before and that were smaller or that were, less perfect. And so there was a lot of trial and error. It wasn't just like this miraculous, discovery and the pyramid was there. I mean, and we're talking about 20, 30 years to build. These are monuments that would have been a lifetime of folks working on them. So, yeah. And that's like I'll say folks working on them. The other misconception is that the pyramids were built by enslaved peoples.
Yeah.
And we don't have great evidence for that. We have evidence that folks were paid, right? We have some of the workers' barracks, like at the site. What I do tell people is that working the pyramids probably was not a lovely life, though. Just because they weren't enslaved doesn't mean that they were living. Everybody working on the pyramids was living in luxury. Like there's probably was a lot of back-breaking labor that was not fun, and they probably were not all treated very well. So there's like a lot of room there for it to still be a pretty rough experience for a lot of people. But we don't have that evidence that there are mass enslaved populations that were used to build it. At least again, we don't have positive evidence to say that there were. We might one day, but not yet, right? But we don't have evidence for those sort of mass enslaved populations. So a couple common misconceptions that I think come up a lot in my classes, at least.
Yeah, the slave thing goes back, I think, to I want to say the Talmud, maybe, and interpretations. And again, it's interesting to see how the pyramids inspired, and ultimately Herodotus. How the pyramids inspired and these kind of outlandish ideas about how they were built that have nothing to do with reality by people who are commenting on it, thousands of years after they were built. Even Herodotus is a couple thousand years later, right? And he's relying on accounts even within Egypt that perhaps were already distorted as well. But you can understand it if you've been there, right? Because these are impressive monuments. And it really is mind-boggling to think. And Jason, you raised the point about administration, and in some ways, that's the most impressive thing.
Yeah,
because they had to make sure that so many stones reached the pyramid. They had to do, and that was all about logistics, right? It's cutting the stones, which are actually taken mostly from nearby. That's another myth. That the stones came from some distance. Most of them didn't. A few of the bigger pieces in the interior chambers did, but the Nile is a nice highway, so you slap them on a boat, and you can get even a 60-ton block. It's a lot of work, but you can do it. And then the casings came from, but not that far away. So it was really an administrative dance, right? And making sure all the workers got fed, tools, everything else. And now recently there was a discovery of some papyri dealing with the administration of the construction of Khufu's pyramid, the Great Pyramid, that gives us some more background on the logistics of it. So again, it kind of, a great Egyptologist who's been working at Giza for a long time. He's the one who found the settlement area. Mark Lehner always said that the pyramids were built by Egyptians, but they also built the Egyptian state, right? By creating this infrastructure, hierarchy, and everything else. Like Julia said, if you were schlepping stones around, it probably wasn't the best life. Although I would say at this point we have more than just an absence of evidence of slavery. I think there's enough evidence that these were a combination of professional people who probably did do well. So the ones who were like the really skilled stonemasons, the artisans, and other people who were doing that kind of work.
And they were getting nice, and we have evidence in some of the workers' barracks, right, of these pretty nice meals of pretty luxurious meats and vegetables and honeys and wine, beer, whatever it was. Don't quote me on all of that, but it was a pretty luxurious banquet that some of these folks were getting pretty regularly. So they were probably getting paid and treated okay, at least again at the higher echelons.
Well, they were eating a lot of meat, which is something that was expensive in Egypt, especially beef. And so, which makes sense when you think about it, right? Because you've got a workforce that's burning a lot of calories, schlepping big stones around. And so you need to feed them well so they can keep their energy up and everything else.
All I've got in my mind is a bunch of people with gout trying to build the pyramids, limping around, trying to cut these forms out. I want to ask you, we first see Daniel Jackson. When we first see James Spader, he's kind of getting laughed out. Everyone's leaving the conference. First of all, do we get that many people into a conference room to begin with? But
sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes for certain people.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, you just did that. So
maybe when they saw the title of the thing, everyone came to heckle him.
Yeah.
Right.
Might also kind of be true.
Yeah.
I've been heckled before myself. That was like, no, be nice to me. One time, I won't go back to Penn State, but here's my question for you:
grad school trauma.
Where is he now? Because we're introduced to Paul and Catherine Langford early in the film. We see Daniel kind of coming along. Obviously, several decades later. In other pods that we've done on the Mummy, on Raiders, we've talked about the history of Egyptology and things like that. But where are we? Where is he now? Are there big movements in Egyptology in, say, the last 30, 40 years? What's going on now? I mean, what is this guy doing that maybe other people were not thinking about at the time or so forth? Or have there been big debates inside the field since then or since this film came out?
Yeah. Do you mean specifically about who's building the pyramids or just broadly?
Just broadly, I think maybe. What are the big questions about Egyptology now? Because Egyptology is not limited to the pyramids, right? This is just a component of that civilization. So what are the discussions? If people listening to this podcast want to learn about Egyptology, what are people talking about?
We had a discussion in my class yesterday where we read something that talked about co-regency, and someone's like, but isn't it obvious if two kings are ruling at the same time? Like, won't they just like have stuff next to each other? And I was like, you won't believe the arguments that people get in about like Sinwaseret co-regencies. But I won't say that's probably a little bit esoteric of an argument. But I think actually, honestly, I think a lot of the stuff that that Stuart does, I think, is really start pushing the field in really interesting ways. I'll say, like, for myself, I am trying to think about, as you said, it's not all about the pyramids, trying to sort of think about the bottom up and the top down and sort of and sideways. So how are people, affecting change? And if we think of power as something that's not unilateral, right? We think of power as something that people buy into, that people negotiate. And so trying to really access these other subaltern actors, right? These folks in antiquity that maybe are underrepresented in the evidence. There's this great book for Roman history called, I think, The Invisible Romans, but it's sort of looking at we maybe don't have textual evidence, for example, there were enslaved people in Egypt, right? People who are owned by others as servants. And we have children, and we have folks who aren't producing a lot of the texts and artifacts that we read and interpret. But we do have in ancient Egypt, we have these sort of cut out spaces, right? So we know something belongs here. It's very similar to like astronomy, right? Where we can't actually really see a black hole, but we can see how things are interacting around the black hole. Well, we have that for antiquity. And so we can kind of see how things are interacting around this area and then use that to sort of shape and understand what's going on for folks who are otherwise invisible in our archaeological textual records. And I think that sort of work is really what's kind of where the field is moving and where we're debating. And there's a lot of pushback against, well, that doesn't seem super well founded and grounded in evidence. And, and there's a little bit of pushback, I think, there. And I've drawn off of and used a lot of Stuart's work in my sort of trying to also move in that direction. But I think really the questions of identity and sort of how we define ourselves and sort of public and private and all these different things. And I know Stuart's done a lot of work in questioning sort of the Egyptian kingdom and its sort of role on the frontier zones, like in looking in Nubia and sort of thinking about, we think of Egypt as this monolithic, powerful entity. And so it's kind of like what Roman in sort of classical tradition, they had sort of reckoning, I don't know, maybe 30 years ago, right, with Romanization and this idea that assimilation is not just like the Roman Empire goes and everything's Roman, and that it's actually hybridity. And we use these terms like, these other sort of terms that communicate entanglement and that cultures come together. And so it's not just the Egyptians going to Nubia and saying, now we're here, everything's Egyptian. But Stuart's work and those who sort of build off of that sort of thing really sort of are talking about how, well, maybe this is actually more complicated. So instead of me talking about Stuart, I guess you can just also share your own work.
Yeah, I think you characterize my views pretty well. And so coming from a background of anthropology as well as Egyptology, so I'm interested in anthropological theory and questions especially surrounding identity. And so how do you get something like ethnic identity, which I've written a lot about and thought a lot about? How do you identify that in the archaeological record? And it's not so easy. Even in the material record today, it's hard because ethnicity is this sort of always constructed as this kind of very bounded thing.
How do you know I'm Puerto Rican, right?
Yeah, exactly.
When people ask, when people ask questions like, and I promise I won't interrupt you again, but when, people ask questions like, were the ancient Egyptians Black? Were the ancient Egyptians white? These are all constructs, right? These are social constructs. We can talk about skin tone, but I'm not particularly brown, but I'm still Puerto Rican, and so so ethnicity and these sort of questions are not always one-to-one correlated.
Time out. No, time out, because like Puerto Rico is my favorite place on the planet. From where?
Yeah, so I have family down mostly in Ponce. But
shit, Ponce's my town.
What?
I am not kidding. Ponce is my okay, sorry, I had to know.
That's amazing.
Right,
we went to San Juan just last January, and it was like the best trip of my life. Like, just love Puerto Rico. Like, I think I want to like buy a home and retire there.
I've said for years I'll die in Rincon, but that's just because that's like where all the gringos live and the surfing is good. But I'm sorry, sir. We totally derailed you with our love for Puerto Rico. I'm sorry.
I love Puerto Rico so much.
Y'all go back.
But
but I think these questions, right, of ethnicity and identity, it's like I don't particularly express as Puerto Rican, but I do have that background. I do have that identity. And so how does that where would that be in my archaeological record? I have some Puerto Rico earrings. Maybe you find those if I'm buried with them, in the equivalent of ancient Egypt. But if my family decides to not bury me in those, then like how do you find it? Maybe you find some secret spices in my kitchen. And that's what the stuff that I really love what Stuart does, is looking at food ways.
Yeah.
Because I think food is the truth, right? And there's so much about our identity embedded in our food and what we eat and what we drink and how we cook, and the tools we use to cook. So I think, you look in someone's trash, you look in someone's spice rack, like that's where you're finding out like where they've traveled, what their worldview is. And Stuart's done some really interesting work on that and looking at identity.
Yeah. And you just have to think about sort of what are the material correlates and how might they express it. But you also have to realize that identity is not an essential quality. It's a moving target, right? Mm-hmm. So depending on the social context, you might express one identity or another identity. Ethnicity might be the most important thing, especially in borderlands, like you see in Nubia. Identity kind of comes to the fore. But gender is also there, religion, other cultural aspects and this kind of stuff. And it's all kind of intersectional in complicated ways. And so teasing that out is tricky, especially if you want to go beyond the elite. So, I mean, most of what we know from the historical record and the art historical record is from the perspective of the top, optimistically 10 to 15%, probably narrower than that, and especially focused on royal ideology. And this is something you really see with ethnicity. You often get Egyptologists will say, oh, ancient Egyptians were xenophobic, Nubians were, completely discriminated against and were, not a part of Egyptian society, when in fact we know the Nubians were interacting all the time. They could express aspects of Nubian identity in the form of jewelry and things like this, foodways. See a lot of Nubian pottery in Egypt, a lot of Nubian cooking pots. And that's what we're seeing even in the colonies. You see these sort of elements of cuisine seem to be coming in and entangling. I like this idea of entanglement a little bit more than hybridity. Hybridity is kind of a mashup, but entanglement is an interweaving and creating these sort of new cultural fabrics. It can be quite diverse. So it can be different from site to site, from household to household even. And it's hard to look at these questions. And sometimes you just won't have the evidence. But on the other hand, I think it's worthwhile because that's the only way you can get at the broader society. And the only way you can do that is through archaeology, which is not to say that traditional Egyptology, which is temples and tombs and hieroglyphs and all that other stuff, isn't worthwhile and cool and part of the picture and helps us interpret what we find in the archaeological record. But too often the view of the archaeological record is that it's the handmaiden of history, a famous saying that actually a prehistorian said, like Glenn Daniels, in around 1950, coined that term. But the idea that the only use of archaeology is to support and kind of like illustrate the historical record. But I go more with another older scholar who has a storied past, William Matthew Flinders Petrie, and we can talk about some.
Oh, Petrie! We ran Petrie through the mill in the Raiders podcast.
Yeah, so Petrie is fraught, and speaking of the diffusionist models, I mean, migration and diffusion was his idea of culture change. Although he gets kind of a bad rap with the dynastic race because he actually is more complicated than that. It was Walter Emery and Douglas Derry that really pushed that one. And earlier than that, not in Glidden. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. But the cool thing about Petrie is he also did some important things. And I think it's important to recognize that these figures in the past are complicated. You have to acknowledge the problematic nature of Petrie's involvement with eugenics, for example, and not just involvement, but I mean, really active participation. But at the same time, he argued that the discipline should shift from what it was before, antiquarianism, basically looting, Indiana Jones, and he had some of these wonderful quotes from a book called Method and Aims in Archaeology. I don't know if you hear the motorcycle in the background, but anyway, and one of my favorites is every object is a portion of life solidified. So he said that every little sherd, every little scarab, every little object was important. And these were things that people were just throwing away in the past and sometimes still today don't treat very seriously. But they can tell us about people in the past, people who are forgotten from history. And this is another snippet that I love that has inspired me from Petrie, again, acknowledging that he had his problematic side, but he also said that the work of the archaeologist is to save lives, to bring, and of course he said, he used man and this kind of thing in a way that we wouldn't use today. But anyway, but to bring people, men who are forgotten from history back into human consciousness, back into the consciousness of mankind, I think he used. But anyway, you get the idea, and the idea that we can, and this is what drives me as an archaeologist, is that I can connect with these people in the past who are forgotten from history and tell something about their lives, even from a potsherd, like the piece of a cooking pot found in a trash heap on an ancient settlement. You can say something about the person that used it. You can say something about the person that made it. If it, depending on the stylistic considerations, you can say something about its cultural affinities and affiliations and what that says about intercultural interaction. If you can get residues from it, then you can actually tell what people were eating on a day-to-day basis.
Tell if they were eating a candy bar and if it was very sweet. That's my question.
Julia, just want to know if ancient Egyptians were eating mofongo. That's all I want to know.
No, it's trifungo because it has African roots, right?
Perfect. Okay.
Well,
now you had to make it real. So
my favorite line in Ancient Egyptian from the film, which it has to do with the candy bar, that the Daniel Jackson gives to the leader of the local community as a sort of peace offering, and he opens it up and he takes a bite and he says, "Bani, Bani way," which in Ancient Egyptian means "how sweet."
This blew my mind as a student learning Egyptian hieroglyphs. So I've seen the movie before. I was in college learning hieroglyphs in the undergrad, translating text. And then we watched this movie probably for my 10th time. And I saw that and I was like, wait, that's the actual term. Like, it blew my mind. Like, that was the moment also for me that just completely, it wrecked me. Right. And that's one of the reasons why I will love this movie forever, even though it's a little slow. It's a little dated sometimes, compared to some of these other great, action flicks. They could probably do with a little bit more, I don't know, action that I would want to see these days. Right. But it holds such a special place in my heart. And in part because of those moments that was really is dedicated in there because of you, Stuart, which is just so special to get something.
Every Egyptologist watching it had that reaction, right? At that moment.
I want to ask actually about linguistics in this film because I feel like it's weird. Linguistics when it comes into films, this film 13th Warrior has probably my favorite linguistics scene ever, where they're sitting around the fire and all that. We talked about it on the pod. Everyone it's amazing. You get a bunch of scholars together talk about words and the transformation of words, and we all geek out over the same scenes and the same stuff. Hunt for Red October does the same thing when it just does the zoom in, zoom out, and so forth. But I do want to know, because it's one of my favorite parts. One of the driving parts of this film is this discovery of language. Obviously, when Jackson walks up and he does all the stuff, but then later on, when he's starting to cognate how to actually speak the language, and that's really another big key turning point in this film. So, first of all, Stuart, Julia, is that possible? Do we know what people sounded like thousands of years ago based upon written language now? How does it operate? How much is that real, and how much is that kind of studio fantasy?
So I'll say my answer, and then Stuart can give you the correct answer.
Okay.
But I'll say from my experience, because this is not necessarily my area of specialty, and I've never worked to help vocalization of ancient languages, right, for recording for film. So as best as I understand, we have the essence of it, right? Ish. We can kind of speak it ish, but we don't know every nuance, right? And so the latest stage of Egyptian language is Coptic, and Coptic is written in Greek plus some other symbols, right? And we know how to pronounce those Greek symbols pretty well. Greek is a language that has persisted. We never really lost it. So we can pronounce, and we know about different dialects of Coptic, right? So when we study Coptic, we can study different dialects. We can study different pronunciations within those dialects. And then we can kind of trace that backwards. We can also use other languages that include vowels. So ancient Egyptian doesn't have vowels written into it. has things like glottal or, like glottal stops and things like that, but it doesn't have vowels. So we're kind of adding those in. And that's why when people look at the sun god Re, they sometimes see it spelled R-E or R-A, Ra, because that E and the A is actually just us kind of trying to manufacture a glottal stop, but that's not an actual vowel right there in the same way that, so that's why I think these vowels kind of shift in English or in other languages. But yeah, so we also have languages like Akkadian, right? Other languages that have vowels and have syllable pronunciations of things that will spell out, ancient Egyptian place names or people names. And so we can kind of use that to reconstruct things as well. So we do have an idea. And Jim Allen, who is an advisor who I worked with at Brown, has really done a lot of work in thinking about, phonology and sort of pronunciation and where accents were, where the emphasis were, and really sort of reconstructing poetic meter in the same way that we reconstruct poetic meter in Latin. But still, pronunciation, I would argue, is not 100% there. But Stuart, what do you think? I mean, it's good enough for an Egyptologist to listen to that and recognize it immediately. We all knew immediately what it was. It's just whether it was precisely like that, I think we're still on the fence.
Well, precisely,
Of course.
But I think it's a pretty good reconstruction of what it sounded like. I mean, we have direct evidence for a small number of words, those cuneiform texts that Julia was talking about, that transcribe names into cuneiform, which is a syllabary, so it includes the vowels. So you also have to make a few corrections when you're doing it because it's a syllabary. But that's well known in linguistic circles. It's you can do it; it's not a problem. But that only gives you a small number of words that you can then go to Coptic and look at how they look, and then go back again. The one correction I would make is that Re is actually correct. So that's what it is in Coptic. So the E in this case for Re is actually a vowel, and it's the vowel that's left. And the Ein, which is normally how it's spelled with an R plus an Ein. And for Stargate, I added a wow, a W at the end, because that's how it's spelled in the earliest form.
Yeah.
And then the W drops, and then the Ein drops, and in Coptic you're left with Re.
Yeah.
But that's one of the words we actually know how it was pronounced. We know it was in the New Kingdom when those cuneiform texts existed. It was pronounced as Lia. So you have. You do have the vowels, and you can reconstruct that there, and we know what that is. And I'll give you one more example. So another name that shows up is Ramses, the famous Ramses II. And his full name was Ramses Meriamun, Ramses beloved of Mun. And even Ramses is a little sentence, right? So it's Re bore him or engendered him. And so you get grammar as well when you have these transcribed names, right? So you can think about conjugations and things like that, how verbs work. And that one, Egyptologists just take these, the consonants that are kind of semivowels, so like a wow, a y, a yud, an ein, and transcribe them as a vowel just to make it easier. So Ra, Re becomes Ra, Ramses is Ramesses or Ramses. But we know how it was pronounced, and it was Ri'ama Sesa Mai Amani. One interesting thing about Amani, the name of the god Amun, is that that's the way it's spelled in Nubian, in Meroitic, which is really cool. So we have all this other evidence. You can pull from some other languages. There's some intermediate examples in ancient Greek and Persian, for example. So we know the pronunciation of Tutmosis, which I wish I could just rattle off. I can't think of it offhand right now, but that's another one we know really well, and it's Tehutamis or something like this, or Tahut, or anyway, I'd have to look it up. But we know that one. We know a bunch of others as well. But the process of reconstruction, and this is what, when they came to me with the idea for this film, they described would be the conceit. The Egyptologist goes to the other planet, hears the language, doesn't understand it to start with, but then figures it out. That part is plausible, because Egyptologists horribly mispronounce ancient Egyptian.
Right.
And
that's what I meant more, is that we write it in ways that don't reflect, even if we know how it's pronounced, it's not the way that's written.
Yeah.
How we're transcribing it.
So it's just a matter of convenience, really. And the only reason, you need to reconstruct the original pronunciation is if you're interested in a more linguistic approach, right? In comparative linguistics, understanding how the language relates to other members of the language group, to other ancient and modern languages, and so on. And I just happened to study at a place where that was big. So I didn't really study with the late John Callender because he sadly was already very ill with AIDS in the late 80s, which, happened. But he was around, and I studied with his students, and they all vocalized. So he was really into pronunciation. And in fact, his work is foundational for my vocalizations of the ancient Egyptian. He actually had them do language labs like you do in a modern language where they would listen to tapes. And sadly, we were a while after he passed away, a couple of people thought, oh, crap, we should see if those tapes still exist. And they'd been talked out, which is a real shame.
That's
a real loss, really. It's a pity. But then he was replaced by Antonio Loprieno, who is also one of these scholars like Jim Allen, who is very interested in vocalization and pronunciation. And again, from Antonio's point of view, more from that linguistic side of understanding the structure of the language. I think from Jim's point of view, like you were saying, it's understanding the poetry of it, which I also can really appreciate. And that's one of the things that working on the film gave me was that level of appreciation. So when they came to me with this conceit, I said, oh yeah, I can do that. And so I put it in a few places in the film, like when he points to the symbol of the Eye of Re, he says Ra, and the local guy goes, eh? Because of course to him it's real. Which doesn't sound like Ra at all, right? And so on. But then I wrote the scene where he has his epiphany and understands. And he's pointing, he pronounces something and it's kind of similar to the way that they're pronouncing it.
It's maybe my favorite scene in the film.
Well, thank you. I wrote it, totally.
I love that scene.
I was just giving the background, and he said,
"It's an intellectual scene."
Tell me how. No, and it's beautiful. And Antonio loved it. He said, he saw the film. He said, "Oh, I love the film, Stuart," and oh, that scene. and it was the where he points to the figure of the god, and he says Necher, and then she corrects him Nate, and then he circles around a group of gods Necheru and says Naturu. And that kind of illustrates all of those changes that happen over time, right? In the language, from going from the full-on spelling of ancient Egyptian that we see in the hieroglyphs to Coptic. And so it really illustrates what the difference it makes to put the vowels in, but then also this loss of consonants. But then with the plural, the consonant comes back. So it's a really interesting phenomenon, and it just sort of encapsulated it in a really nice way. But I think it's also plausible. So, I mean, the way, the vocalizations that I did would be probably maybe understood by an ancient Egyptian, but as like a horrible mispronunciation probably of ancient Egyptian, or at least like a little off.
I mean, come on.
It's like going to Wales.
Language. Like give yourself a break,
Yeah.
I think one of the things I love so much about what you're saying about language and writing in the movie is how language and writing is so tied into agency and power, right? And knowing where you came from. Oh, yeah. And I love that sort of through line of how, writing is outlawed in part because it empowers people, because it allows people to have for memory to persist. It allows people to, communicate over time and space. And then when writing sort of comes back and, she takes the folks, at the sort of end and says like, look, I want you to know, like, Daniel Jackson showed me this, and this is like where our people came from, and that was such a poignant sort of transition moment in the film, because, they were really kind of like, we shouldn't have helped this guy. Like, a lot of people just died. Like, why do we do this? And it's like, well, no, but look, like, this is where we came from. And the only way that sort of existed was because of the writing, because that heritage, that history was preserved in writing. And so I think, I do think in ancient Egypt too, writing was something that was kept, really used mostly by the few, and it was something that was seen as particularly powerful, both in the hieroglyphs themselves as like potent symbols, but also just in the power of being able to record and have records and sort of, being responsible for that memory. I always think of 1984, right? It's whoever sort of owns. So like in 1984, there's these scenes where they're rewriting the history textbooks and they're just republishing the history textbooks to make it match with whomever they're like at war with. They always were at war with, right? And it really is like, if you can reconstruct and if you can control knowledge and writing, like we trust writing so inherently as a species. And if we see something written, then we're sort of likely to believe it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I loved that through line of just the power of the written word as, you know, this empowering force that we see really at this like really key transitional moment.
Yeah, that also connects to, in general, a kind of anti-imperial subtext to the film in a way that not everyone gets, because there've been a few commentaries which see it as, you know, sort of the rah white savior kind of thing going on, and there is a little bit of the white savior in there, but in fact it's more complicated than that.
Oh yeah.
And in fact what it's about is not a bunch of people coming in and saving these people, but about how, you know, you have this ideology that's used to control people, and what happens when you know, kind of break the veil of this ideology. And there's an anthropologist named James Scott who just passed away, but he wrote a couple of really excellent books where he talks about this idea of the facade of ideology. I mean, think you know, in North Korea, for example, you know, these great, you know, these grand events that where they, you know, the army marches through, but they have like women and everybody's crying and, oh, the great leader and all of this. And ancient Egyptian festivals must have been much the same way. But in the same way, you have to question how much of this is what people really believe, how much of it is what they had to perform, and where the, you know, probably it's, you know, it always is more complicated in these situations. But on the other hand, one of the reasons why states enforce those kind of boundaries is that once you break that, once you see, you know, like in The Wizard of Oz, once you pull the curtain aside and you see what's really there, then that can bring the whole system crashing down. And I think that's also that execution scene, which again, ancient Egyptian very much aligns with, you know, ancient Egyptian events in front of temple pylons, even inscribed on temple pylons, these giant scenes of the pharaoh whacking enemies and dominating enemies and things like this. You know, sends these ideological messages out. And writing was an important part of reinforcing that, and also a way of subverting that. So if you remember the elite and literate and could read, I think, yeah, there was a sort of semi-literacy too that allowed people to engage with these things more than many Egyptologists give them credit for. Again,
I always talk to students, and when I you know, I'm teaching world history or Egyptian history, and I write up on the board like ETC, and I'm like, what is ETC? They're like, etc. I'm like, oh, so you speak Latin? Yeah. And like, well, no. I'm like, but you recognize, right? Exactly. Like you understand, or, you know, this certain particular cultural milieu. I'm like, oh, you speak French. It's like we can use terms and we can know how to use terms in our language without fully being literate in this other language, right? Borrowed terms. And that's obviously not an exact, you know, correlation, but I think it's a good example of how I think a lot of ancient Egyptians knew a number of terms. You know, they probably knew to recognize a cartouche. They could recognize the king's name. They could like, and that, you know, and that's still common in modern semi-literate societies, right? Where you have folks who are semi-literate, people are usually can recognize some things. Maybe they can sign their name. Maybe they can recognize a few things. They're just not fully literate. And you can be quite functional with a semi-literate background, you know, education today and in antiquity. I also, I don't know what made me think of this, but as you're talking, I think about just some of the different like actors. I did think this cast, I wanted to make sure we hit on the fact that this cast is surprisingly like deep bench.
Yeah.
There's a lot of folks, like I think this is French Stewart's like first film, I think I read. And I'm going to say his name wrong. Jimon Hansu.
This is baby Jimon Hansu's film. Like he is an infant in this movie. Yeah. In fact, he goes by Jimon in this movie.
Jimon,
and like, and he's like amazing. Like there's so many, you know, like so many people. Eric Avery and like all these folks who are in this film who are like really, really good. And I think, and I read something, you know, one of the like, you know, IMDb facts page, it was like, and I forget who it was like two of the actors would just like try to keep talking in ancient Egyptian, like in between scenes and stuff. So like, it seems like everybody like really like bought into it, you know? And I know from some of your commentary on or maybe I won't out you. I'll just say that I think in The Mummy, for example, not everybody bought in as much into speaking and being authentic to the ancient language. But I feel like this movie, people really just were buying in, and were like wholeheartedly, the actors were in it. Even though James Spader, right, famously says like, sometimes I take a movie for money. But like, even though it's like, yeah, you need to take a movie for money, like, but James Spader's like 100% in it, like he is such an actor,
Yeah, no, I worked with him closely, and also just I was always around on set when he was there, and he was very engaged. And it was interesting because he did take it for money, for sure, because he was building a yacht, and he was having it
as one does,
handcrafted from a 1914 America's Cup, design. He showed me the half hull, beautiful.
Oh, hobbies.
And apparently he was like single-handedly responsible for reviving the artisanal boat industry in New England in doing this. But then he also said, I'm never going to get a film after I do this. So I think that's how he approached it. So he approached it that, I'm doing this for the money. I wouldn't have taken it otherwise. But if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do the best job I possibly can and bring what his strengths were, which I think is one of the reasons why his portrayal of an Egyptologist is one of the most convincing, and just an academic in general, because he took that seriously. And he was constantly working with the director and the writer to tweak his role. Mm-hmm. And then getting a lot of background from me as well about, sort of what it's like to be an academic.
Now, I have a question, Jason, if you don't mind me putting on my host for a second. And I don't know.
You guys always do this.
I don't know if you have any idea, Stuart, about this. Do you have any thoughts or insider knowledge on how this movie may or may not have influenced Fifth Element? Because for me, watching some of these internal temple scenes, it feels very Fifth Element-y to me. And some of the reading of the glyphs, and then also the sort of focus on somebody who's kind of like learning a new culture and learning language in the process. And this, and obviously Fifth Element is, takes the sci-fi component, I think, a little further.
Yeah.
I guess films, by the way. They're not extraterrestrial, but still, it's like.
Are we going to have to do that movie on the pod?
Oh, 100%. I love.
Do you know how much I hate that movie? Oh my gosh!
Oh, now we have to.
We're going to do it. Yeah. We're going to do it. All right.
Yeah, and
it's an awesome movie. And you got to love the anthropology scene at the beginning too. Well, it makes me think of the movie of that big outcrop with the
right. So, do you think is there about any clear like intentionality there, or do you think that's just?
Yeah, it may just be coincidence. It could be. I mean, the way he's like going through, and it is kind of reminiscent of that scene in the underground area where he's parsing it out. But it's hard to say. And of course, they did have an alternate language in the film as well. That eventually you sort of have to come to terms with. But she eventually figures out how to speak English. So it's a little kind of the flip side of that.
All right, Fifth Element coming up. See, I use
this is one of two films I said was banned from this podcast. The other is Hoosiers, but that's because I'm from Kentucky, Stuart. Yeah, we don't do Indiana where I'm from.
I won't fight you on that one.
Yeah.
No. Let's do Fifth Element. Like, too many people love this film. So
and also back to you mentioned James Allen wanting to like hear the music of the language. And that was one of the, apart from, the experience of being on a big Hollywood production, the money and so on. One of the best things about working on the movie was I remember exactly the moment too. It's a scene where it's in the village and they've tried to give Sherry, the leading lady, in marriage to this god who's come from another place to pacify him or whatever. And the Egyptologist character, being a gentleman, sort of shoos her out. And then the dad freaks out because he thinks that she's offended him or something. Mm-hmm. And that actually, what made it into the film is actually a really condensed version of what the actual dialogue was. And I just remember sitting there, I was embedded in the set. They tucked me into a corner and given me a headset so I could hear what people were saying so I could correct their language and whatnot. But I was completely embedded in the set and the scene and the actors. And I suddenly had this epiphany. And ancient Egyptian literally came alive for me at that moment. I could hear the music of it. And that was just really, really cool. It gave me a whole new understanding and appreciation of the language, which is why I'm always annoyed when Egyptologists, not you, Julia, but when Egyptologists come and say, oh, we don't know how ancient Egyptian was pronounced at all, which is wrong. And even if the reconstruction is imperfect, it gives you a sense of that musical quality to it. And I think if you're trying to understand poetry, ancient Egyptian poetry, or songs like the love songs, for example, you have to do that in order, or you're not getting to a complete understanding of it. So this is where I side with Jim as well, that it's important to do this. It's not important to translation because you can translate it perfectly well without the vowels.
I mean, yes and no, right? I mean, so yes, but the poetry, the music is part of the language.
Absolutely.
You know, it's part of the meaning. It's another layer of that meaning. So you could translate it, but you're going to miss all of this connotation and all of this power and energy that comes with it. And there's something to that. I think speaking it is, it's, as you said, like, even if we can't do it 100% perfect, like, that's okay. You know, like, it doesn't have to be exact. We don't have to, like, do it only within this one dialect or something. Like, I think sometimes Egyptologists or scholars get, like, too hung up on things having to be perfect and not trying it out. And it's like, let's just try it out. Maybe in 20 years we'll realize we made a mistake, and, like, that's okay, because, like, we're still learning, and we're learning by trying it out. And that's one of the things, even with a movie like this, I love movies like this so much. Yes, of course there's problems in terms of aliens did not build the pyramids, and hopefully people don't think that that's the case, but we're able to enjoy, right? Like, we can have this foundational, it really is a sort of metaphor for what I hope to do is sort of engaging with popular culture in my teaching and education, right? We can have real, concrete, real Egyptology and something that's really fun and hyper realized and ridiculous, right? Like, kind of around it. We can have, these glowing eyes and this amazing, raw character happening all alongside the other stuff, and that doesn't negate it. And I think too often, I thought you were going to say at first, Egyptologists can just sort of dismiss movies like this, or dismiss work like this, like the work that you were doing, even, as like somehow not real work. And it's like, this is such important work that you are doing, and so important that we keep doing this sort of thing, so we can continue to have fun. What did Disney call it? It's like edutainment.
Yeah.
Right? Educational entertainment. Like, that's what we need. We need more of that.
Well, that's always my response to the question of, do you feel guilty for having, put your imprimatur on these films and somehow given them dignity? But my reaction is just the opposite, is like, they're going to make the film, right? Yeah. And especially the Mummy movies are a good example of this. Stargate, they were really interested in my participation. The Mummy movies, I was just sort of a gimmick. And if I hadn't consulted on them, they would be worse. But as it is, there are some nice little Easter eggs in there. And the language turned out well, especially in the second film. And so all of that wouldn't be there. It would just be, a kind of cheesy Hollywood thing without that.
It would be God's Egypt.
Yeah, exactly so. Or the 2017 Mummy movie with Tom Cruise.
Yeah.
We're not talking about that.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Do you know, like, when I announced we were doing that pod, people were like, are you doing this? No, it's like when we did Red Dawn. It's like, we're not doing, no. We're doing the one people watched. I want to ask you, Stuart and Julia, is it possible for you to critique this film? Do you have things about this movie when you go back to watch it and you go, and if so, what are they?
Yeah, there are. But it's interesting because I will shameless plug for my article soon to appear in Egyptology. I'm not sure exactly when, but I'm getting all these little permission things, so I think it's coming soon. But one of the things I pointed out was that you can critique these things, like the space aliens, also the white savior thing, and then there's the whole queer subtext of the film, which has been interpreted sometimes as, because the queer character it's evil. It's the villain. It could be seen as sort of queer bashing. But in fact, when you start examining it more closely, you see that each one of those things is mitigated by other factors within the film that make the negative impact of them less. So yeah, totally space aliens. I mean, it's problematic on a number of levels. Not as bad as Atlantis, which is worse because that's a total fantasy of white supremacists. I mean, literal Nazis, not just figurative Nazis, literal Nazis. In the Third Reich, and modern Nazis are the ones who are writing about this stuff. Yeah. Eric von Däniken, I mean, he does mention Stonehenge and the Antikythera mechanism. So he's sort of a little equal opportunity, but like 90% of what he talks about is non-Western. So it definitely plays into those tropes. But with Stargate, the thing that mitigates it is the casting, what we were talking about earlier. And and I think one of the reasons they got such great actors is they got a lot of people who, weren't typical Hollywood actors, which means they were dark skin and of various ethnicities, right? That normally don't get cast prominently in a film. But Dean Devlin, the writer-producer, is Filipino and dark, really dark. And he kept getting cast as the Middle Eastern terrorist and, the usual Hollywood things. And so he said, okay, when we cast this film, for one thing, we want to make the ancient Egyptians African. And we want to cast them and make them look like North Africans. So the casting you see with Jaimin, with other actors like Alexis Cruz, who was one of the ones who was, I gave them a whole bunch of like random dialogue that they could just go and be chatting in the background of a scene. And every once in a while you can see it's pretty cool. But, so he's a Hispanic and so on. And all the other actors, Jay Davidson is mixed race, sort of African British. So you have you have a cast that looks like North Africans. And so that kind of blunts it a little bit because when you think about reception, right, what people are taking away, okay, space alien things, maybe they think about that. But then when they think about ancient Egyptians, they're thinking about people who look like Africans and not a bunch of white guys like in Exodus Gods and Kings or Gods of Egypt, even worse, and so on. And a host of other films going back, I mentioned, or not Exodus, but the Ten Commandments for the C.C.B. DeMille film, where again, all the actors are more or less white. Yul Brynner, I don't know what color his real skin was, but they had him bronzed anyway. And he totally looks like Ramses II. But anyway, that's another aside. But I think that does help blunt it. Similarly, the white savior thing, again, there was a commentary where they thought it, was kind of a justification somehow of the Gulf War, which was totally off base. And in fact, I know from talking with Dean Devlin, their conception of the James Spader character was T.E. Lawrence, which makes sense because Lawrence was an archaeologist. And like many archaeologists at the time, he was kind of a spy. And so during the First World War, in the Gulf War, first Gulf War, which would happened a couple of years before the film was produced, and like 3 years before it came out, that was a giant coalition, massive, multiple armies, massive, overwhelming force. And then when it came to supporting the insurgents in Iraq, the U.S. said, "Job done. Bye-bye. Good luck." And Saddam Hussein went in and killed them all. But here, what we have is much more like what T.E. Lawrence did, which was he went out more or less alone and helped mobilize the Arab resistance against Ottoman rule, which already existed, but he just provided basically the logistical support and tie-ins with the British. And recently, T.E. Lawrence also, Edward Said criticized him for sort of, kind of wanting to drive the agenda. But in fact, I think I would agree with him on the one point that, let's be fair. He was coming at it from a certain perspective, but he definitely was out for the interests of the people he was working with. And this recently resurfaced a map of how he would have divided up the Middle East after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. And it was a much better map than Sykes, I can't remember the second name, the final map that has created so many problems. There was a Kurdish homeland, there was an Armenian homeland. Iraq, he didn't quite know what to do with, but it was a much more rational thing. The whole Lebanon thing, and Syria was much more intelligently organized. And so the logic of the map was the logic of the people who lived there and the political structures that existed there in a way that both made more sense and would have made things a lot better. So again, Lawrence, a little bit fraught, but in fact, again, blunted by that. And I think you can see that with the James Spader character as well, the Daniel Jackson, right? He goes in, and yeah, it's kind of the white savior, but it's that scene where the heroine goes down and all the guys are all dejected. I mean, ultimately, it's their agency.
Right. I agree. I don't think it's white savior at all. Like,
Yeah,
I don't think so either.
I think if anything, the white guys are all the bad guys.
Yeah, exactly.
like they try to bring a nuke. They're all, it's all military.
Yeah, they're really trigger happy, and
they're not.
And the James Spader character is constantly criticizing them, right? Pushing back and saying, put down your guns. You don't need to do this.
There's some bigger things here with our two co-leads too, right? With Spader and Russell, right?
Yeah.
Russell is mourning the loss of his son. He needs to be rebuilt.
Also, I'm sorry. What is with that? That is the darkest random plot line. The fact that right before we meet this character, his son has shot himself. The son killed himself with his gun on an accident. It is such a dark plot line.
And you're thinking he might just do it himself. Because he kind of takes the pistol and slides it underneath the pillow when the guys walk in there, right?
Did you notice?
So here's a man.
You start too that the pillow had hieroglyphs on it.
Oh, I didn't see that.
No,
I wasn't there for that.
Okay. All right. So there's a couple things here because I hear white savior often, and sometimes that exists in the films, but I also feel like that's sometimes some lazy critiques of films. It's too superficial. It's right on the top of the level because what we have here is actually the indigenous people of this other planet are actually doing the saving.
Yeah, exactly.
Quite literally, Daniel Jackson does not have a home when we come across him, and he finds his home with these people. He finds his people. He finds love. He finds a community. He finds a place where he belongs, and that's because that community has embraced him. Yeah. Right? He has found his place. Same as Kurt Russell's character is through his relationships, largely with those kids, is rebuilding himself and finding his own purpose again, and it emerges, frankly, as another man. So it's
they're saved.
There's white saving going on, but it's actually the white people here being saved through this.
Yeah, no, I agree. And even the people who push the white savior line admitted at the end that, in fact, exactly the point you're making, that both Daniel Jackson and Colonel O'Neill were saved by the indigenous people at the end. So O'Neill going from despair and being suicidal, basically, which is why they put him on this mission, right? So he could blow the Stargate up and himself process. But then also, James Spader, the Daniel Jackson, being at loose ends, not knowing where he was going, and suddenly finding, like you say, a home and a place, and he stays on the planet because that's where he stays.
And it's not like he's teaching them language. They already have the language. It's just that writing has been outlawed, but some people even know it. You know what I mean? So it's kind of, or have access.
She knows it.
Yeah.
Right. It's the lady. This isn't like Kingdom of Heaven where Orlando Bloom is showing people how to find water.
Yeah. And the other thing is the queer side as well. So again, you could see the queer villain as a negative, but in fact, and this is what Lim Nesco commented, an Egyptologist who often does theoretical things and whose work I really like. And I actually worked with her on this article that she wrote where she talked about these. But here I disagree with her. And to be fair, she gave two options. She thought, okay, it's really negative, but it could be read as positive in the fact that the queer subplot, so the sexual tension between Daniel Jackson and Ra, is actually much more powerful than the heterosexual romance. Between the two other leads, and it's a through line. I mean, underlies the film, and it fronts, and that sort of androgyny and the casting of Jay Davidson. And this is where, in spite of the fact that he was not comfortable on set, and that affected some of his acting, but the one thing he did brilliantly was convey that sense of queerness. Right, of androgyny, of hybridity, in the sense of transcending definitions, right, and boundaries.
Yeah, it's sort of non-binary before we have language to maybe identify as this, right? I mean, of course, this language has existed for a long time, but it's not as popular part of the popular consciousness. Like, I think I think maybe in the 90s he would have been called gay, but it's really more than that. You know what I mean? It's like, or not more than, but it's different than, right? He's not just, he's really sort of, just transcending definitions and
that's really a very complicated role. And again, like with Dean Devlin's choice of casting, Roland Emmerich is himself gay, but also an activist within the community. And that casting was deliberate. It wasn't the original plot. It was going to be, I think Sir John Gielgud is who they were talking with. It was going to be like the Mummy, right? Sort of a pruny old guy that's revived in using this alien, or that's lived forever using this alien technology. And instead they decided much better. And so they cast Jay because they loved his look and the notoriety from The Crying Game. But that was the character. I mean, that's pretty much Jay's identity, right? And so that was the character that they wanted for the film. And it was very deliberate to create that sort of queer subtext. That again, it sort of confronts the audience and makes them think about it. And so in that sense, I think actually it was both deliberate and ultimately positive, in spite of the fact that the character was,
or neutral, right? Which I think is also so important. Like, I don't think anything about his queerness was mobilized or weaponized sort of for or against, really. You know what I mean? It's just like, this is a character, a figure who, technically they're an alien on an alien planet. So they're not from that planet and they're not from our planet. And so like for them, it's like, what is this sexuality nonsense that you all have? Like, this is, they're like, we're above the plane of binary definitions. It's almost just this, it's almost like, at this higher, more sort of advanced level, like these silly binaries don't even exist. You know what I mean? So it's almost just like a disregard of these social constructions that like exist on Earth. That just like don't really exist for him or for them, and it's but it's not really, in some ways it's not really a positive or a negative as I see it. And that's what's so great about it, is that it's not a particular, there's a subtext there, sure, because that's again intersectional identities, but it's not like that is the driving plot force or something.
Yeah, right. There's a queerness that's present, but it's not. It's not making the character evil.
Exactly. It's not.
This is just what is.
Yeah. It's not directly engaged in his evilness. His evilness is wanting to control everything. But a little bit of
that small part
trivia point. The whole thing with the alien inhabiting him was invented in post. So that was not in the original script. But it was the result of Jay Davidson's performances, which again, the looks that he gave, the poses and everything else were brilliant. But when it came down to his delivery of the dialogue, it was not great and not forceful. And I think that's, to be fair to Jay, he was, for one thing, a recovering drug addict, which is, I'm sure influenced things. I know he was drinking on set anyway. And he offered me a Valium at one point, but which I almost accepted, but I decided not to because it was pretty stressful trying to get him through his lines. But eventually we came up with cue cards, very strange cue cards, but that worked. But
worked for Brando.
Yeah.
But they tested it and he just didn't come across well. So then they added the glowing eyes and the alien inhabited, and then a voiceover. And I read later that Jay actually appreciated that because it kind of helped salvage his performance. So it was a really good choice on their part. But I think to Julia's point, I think it actually does make it even more interesting when you add that element to it, and what Lynn Metzger makes him a sort of cyborg. But that just doubles down on the queerness and this idea of of hybridity. And in a way that sort of defies, and that's not the word I want. It's that sort of breaks stereotypes in a way that creates a new category that you can't pigeonhole into an existing one, right? So it makes you think about things like sexual identity and so on.
We're also making a lot of heteronormative assumptions, right, about the rest of the cast. So just saying that too.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, actually, and this is a thing I wrestle with actually when I go to invite folks on the pod, actually, because I've talked very openly about this, about how I want HATM to always be this very diverse space where people feel like they're welcome. But one of the things I don't do is make assumptions on people like, oh, have you had non-binary people or gay folk or people of color. Like Julia was saying earlier, like, how would I know your Puerto Rican ancestry? These are questions I don't ask because I don't want that to be it's weird. It's like, I just feel like if I just cast a wide net and invite people openly, those folks, like,
if you host it, they will come.
Yeah, kind of. I like that. I want to ask you, before I jump into this, I do want to ask, because part of this film is set 35 miles north of me. I'm in Pueblo, Colorado. And especially in SG1, it's like it's like right next door. Did we miss a chance to talk about colonialism at some point in time? Because the first time we see all this stuff, they're in a mountain in the United States. I'm like, wait a second. Did we steal from Egypt again? How this stuff didn't just happen to get here to Colorado. They had to like pack all this shit up, fly it over here, put it in a mountain.
And they got it from, what was it, the Norwegians? Like, what was the language that the archaeologist was speaking? I feel like it was like, it wasn't, I was like expecting like French or German, and I was like, that's not either of those.
No. And that again was just an improvisation, because the actor they cast was, I believe it is Norwegian, but
so we stole it from the Norwegian archaeological
right,
who may have been working on behalf of the Nazis during the war. Like, there's a whole background here. Like, what if Indiana Jones was engaged in some meta level?
I think so.
With obtaining these. What happens? I'm going to ask you this. This is our What the Florida section. What happens if we set this film in Florida? Like, are they entering a Stargate to another dimension, and it just turns out they end up in Jacksonville?
Right. I'm like, is this other dimension Florida?
Yeah, or is it
feels like it these days?
The pyramids in Florida. I don't know.
Yeah,
actually, can I tell you?
That's right. They go to the pyramid. There's a great Bass Pro pyramid. Is it in Nashville or Memphis?
Yes,
Memphis,
right.
Memphis. Been there. I've been there.
Yeah.
He's the biggest, largest Bass Pro in Springfield, Missouri, because that's where he's from. But we don't have the pyramid.
Yeah.
I've so been to that Springfield, Missouri place so many times. When I was living in Wichita, I think I told you, I used to like stop off there. It's like nice and on the way. Oh, yeah. I always remember Springfield, Missouri as a place with lots of power lines.
Yeah.
So you're driving that. There's so many.
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you that here's our actual Florida thing. Because here's a scene in the film that always gets in my mind. In Florida, as you probably know, we are eat up with invasive species, one of which are actually iguana. So there's the scene there where they're eating that iguana-esque reptile. Okay. And I always kind of in my head go, I swear to you, everything, because folks down in Florida eat them.
It's definitely gator.
I'm sorry?
It's like definitely like a gator. Like that meat looked like gator meat, you know?
Oh yeah. Actually, I'll tell you what, I've eaten a bunch of gator. I think it's too chewy.
Really it is, but it's like if a chicken was a fish.
Right.
That's what gator meat tastes like.
Yeah. I mean, so
that's kind of how it like fell off. I felt like that was like some sort of iguana semi-aquatic creature, you know? So, but I feel like if you're in Florida, maybe it would be iguana, because I guess they do get those big iguanas, but I would think it'd be more like huge. Dinner would be gator.
Gator's good. So yeah, we have a lot. That, and I also like when we first saw that big beast, I'm kind of famous for wanting to eat all the meats. So I looked at
that made me feel very Star Wars, right? Like I saw the big beast.
Yeah, I think that was a little bit of a ripoff.
And again, it's not CGI, so you feel like it's real.
Exactly.
The slobber coming off of it when it's licking Daniel.
Yeah, the face was the guy who did all the animatronics was just amazing. Great. Really.
It's a built world. It's a realized world.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, and the masks were really cool. Of course, the one CGI effect was when they fold back and fold.
Sure, but it's pretty cool.
But when they're walking around, I mean, the heads twist and turn
when they do the thing.
The eyes glow, and then like the on the falcons, the feathers go up. I remember being on set, and a bunch of guys with joysticks doing this and sort of off to the side. But if I just looked at the actor in the costume with the mask on, and I remember at one point I just happened to be standing where he turns his head and looks towards me, and it was the creepiest thing because it looked like, that was the person doing that, even though it was the actor, was just acting, and then the guys were doing all of the manipulation of the mask. But it was really convincing and really, really cool. Again, hyper real in a really neat way. But you wouldn't get that with CGI, and they were gorgeous too. Just really, I mean, the work on the props, especially those, just amazing, and it makes them really convincing.
Yeah, see, this is too technologically advanced for anything outside of Orlando, right? I mean, this could exist in Disney's bubble,
There you go.
or Universal's bubble. I believe probably more Universal. But like, I'm trying to think of the equivalent for Florida. It's like the joke would be if they go through, if a bunch of, I don't know, like angry military white guys from Florida go through the Stargate, but then they just end up in Cuba or something, right? And like that's the big joke.
Right.
Like becomes just like a quick gateway for folks to get back and forth or something. Like that's the jokes on them. I don't know where, like, who would be our like General Hammond in the bunker in Florida, trying to like, and who would be our nerd? Like, who's our great scholar that gets pulled to Florida? Right. That's right.
Me, actually.
What
the guy writing a book about early Florida.
Oh, wait.
That's actually me.
Yeah.
General Hammond. Who are we gonna go for?
I guess his name's not General Hammond. It's Colonel West, I think, in the movie. It's General Hammond.
Oh yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
Oh golly, you know what? I'm gonna volunteer my one of my best friends on the planet, Crystal in Shefflin, because she always gives me orders anyway. This morning I got a nice message being stop being such a baby on Instagram and go back to posting happy shit. So I was like, fine. Places where Floridians would go to, I would say there's a town called Palatka, which is like if Idaho were in Florida, that's where the militias are.
Okay.
So I would say something like that. Florida's a hot mess. I still love it.
Like I can imagine, instead of military like AVs or RV, whatever, like vehicles, they would have like the swamp, the like floating swamp boat.
Yeah, I think it'd be a swamp place, somehow.
Oh no, we'd have the airboats.
Yeah, airboats. Yeah. That's what it is.
Yeah, we'd be down the glades. It'd be fine.
I'm not from Florida.
Oh, there's so much fun. All right, here's my question. My penultimate question for you.
Because I do have a favorite quote, so I want to make sure to get.
Okay. Give me your favorite quote.
Okay,
yes, go ahead.
Real quick, favorite quote. I have two favorite quotes. One is freeze and enhance. The moment where they're watching the film when they put the robot through the Stargate to test and to see what's going on, and he goes freeze and enhance. And I just like it. It's such a classic freeze and enhance moment, So I love that. And then of course, give my regards to King Tut.
Yeah.
I love that line.
Like, I need a shirt.
Well, we could make some HATM shirts.
I know,
we'll probably get sued by the studio.
Yeah. My regards to King Tut, asshole.
I can give you another bit of trivia. So remember the lecture scene that we talked about before? I'm actually in the lecture scene.
What? Oh, I did not see you. Okay, I'm gonna have to rewatch this.
Yeah, so you have to get ideally the letterbox version, because it's
right.
It's a little hard to see, but I'm off to the front left side in the audience and look pretty much the same, except my hair is brown instead of gray.
I'm going to freeze and enhance.
There you go.
Oh,
so you can see me pretty clearly laughing with it. And sadly, the guy next to me had a line, but he blew it, so there was never the tight shot in that you could see me. Although you can see a beautiful view of my back leaving the lecture hall. So I'm wearing a very sort of 90s geometric pattern, gray and white sweater. So, but yeah, I was just on the set that day because anytime Spader had Egyptology, I was there. And I was chatting with the director and the writer, and they said, "Oh, wait, here we have this audience, this lecture hall full of fake Egyptologists, and here we have a real one. You have to be in the scene." I said, "Oh, sure."
Yeah,
that's cool.
And so yeah, I am there. So I'm only like one or two steps away from Kevin Bacon.
Oh yeah,
because I don't think Spader's been in a movie with Kevin Bacon. So
it sounds so much like it was a really welcoming, giving set.
It was
for you. You were spoken so positively, and I love hearing this. Right, like about your experiences. That I love hearing that Spader was like a really cool guy that you could talk to, and whatever. I want to hear the best in people. And I'm like, it frankly, it makes me like the movie that much more, knowing that I have a friend who is involved in this film who has wonderful things to say about it.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it really was. And you know,
cool.
talking to the people on set and everything, it was, you know, it was a good set. And there were a lot of people who were very loyal to him, which speaks both to, you know, Roland's loyalty to, you know, his
you haven't spoken about Russell.
Crew. Well, Kurt Russell was, I didn't have much interaction with him because, you know, he didn't really have it. Yeah, like he has like one line and he's not really supposed to pronounce it correctly anyway. So,
right.
And most of the time, I mean, he was around. He would hang out with the crew and everything, so he wasn't like super stuck up. Goldie Hawn came by the set one time, and they were all pleasant. The one negative interaction I had with Kurt Russell was at one point it was a scene where they've got this sort of caravan thing that's interrupted, and then they shoot one of the Horus enforcer types, and then the Spader character, you know, flips up the mask, and that reveals that this is really a person, not a god. And so there was a lot of dialogue surrounding that. And I was there doing my usual thing. And Kurt Russell came up to me afterwards. You know, it's like 120 degrees because that's how hot it is in that, you know, around Yuma, Arizona. I've done a few things there, and it's toasty during the summer, which is when they were shooting those scenes. And he came up to me and said, "Oh, you know, they're just going to screw up the language. You're going to hate it. This is a waste of time." But I got my revenge because, in fact, it turned out beautiful. So he was totally wrong. I kind of knew he was just being pissy with me, and it was, you know, just because it was hot and everything else. But
it's hot.
Yeah, that's a human nature. Believe me, exactly. I would be the biggest baby in that.
Exactly. Yeah, but it was a little bit of privilege there. But yeah, everyone was committed, including the actors that I work with. So. Even if I'm sure they thought I was a pain sometimes, but I was ordered to be a pain. So I figured I'm going to earn my money, which was not insubstantial. So, you know, whatever the director wants me to do, I'm going to do. And it turned out beautiful. So,
Stuart, and Julia, what does our Stargate reading list look like? Give me 3 books each.
Well, I think I don't know if I would recommend this. I was going to say to understand the larger sort of narrative Chariots of the Gods, right? Like, is the book that sort of was one of the more influential books that really sort of got at this sort of aliens and pyramids and alternative kind of conspiracy understandings of Egypt. But at the same time, I'm like, don't go buy that book. Maybe buy it
out of the library.
Like rent it from the library and read it. You know, find it for free.
It's going to look great on the notes. Right. Okay.
But they did actually use that was their inspiration for the space aliens thing. Although obviously they went a completely different direction than.
And I think they did some interviews. I want to say on the DVD, like commentary or like special features. There were some interviews to that effect, you know, and so it's So I mean,
they actually had Von Däniken, like an interview with Von Däniken.
I feel like maybe they did, right? I'm trying to remember like back. But I feel like,
I remember which extra. It's in one of the extra things, but I'm not sure which one. But I know it's on one of the DVDs, like supplemental things.
Yeah, so I would say instead of that, I would go read anything that Mark Lehner has written on the pyramids and how the pyramids were built, and he's done some interesting experimental archaeology, you know, to sort of figure out like, after you use this chisel, like how fast is the chisel dull, you know, and you have to like resharpen it. And, you know, so he's done a lot of really interesting work and so much like good archaeology at Giza. So it's like, if folks are interested in pyramids, I would say anything by Mark Lehner would be something worth reading. And then I would say like, go read our special volume of this journal that's come out at some point.
Yeah.
Stuart, what do you like?
I know specifically for Stargate is a little bit trickier. I mean, there is another theme that I think applies really well, and that's this concept of the Victorian Gothic, where it fits with the Mummy films as well, very much so. So there's a book in particular by, and I'm probably mispronouncing the name, it's Haefele - Thomas. called Victorian Gothic. And so I drew some from some of that to get the background, but it's the whole idea of coming back to colonialism too. It's the, and you think of books like Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or even more so H. Rider Haggard's She. And there's a lot of good discussion around those, as it's the colonial power. They go out, and they cross a boundary and penetrate beyond, the known and the understandable. Yeah. And then they encounter this malevolent force, whether it's a mummy that's been revived, that they've revived, like in the the 1932 Boris Karloff mummy, directed masterfully by German director Karl Freund. Brilliant film, but Julia, if you're looking for action adventure, it's not that.
Well, I love the 1932. I love horror though, so it is like
it is very. It's more like suspense
but the moments, the very Petri archaeology, like there's so many great. I show in my classes all the time, right? Because it's so full of So I would say, don't go read a book. Go watch that movie if you haven't seen that movie.
Oh, there's a great line in that film too, where the head of the expedition, the young guy, says, open the box, read the scroll that's forbidden and everything else. And the mystical guy is saying, don't do that. And the leader of the expedition says, no. More has been understood from potsherds than has been from great finds like this one. So you don't need to rush into anything. And of course, the young guy rushes in and reads the scroll, and then the mummy wreaks havoc. There's also a book about mummy movies by, what's her name?
Is that Eleanor Dobson's, or is that somebody else?
Eleanor Dobson's work is really interesting too, but it's somebody else who's written specifically about mummies. And I can find it. Unfortunately, as an anthropologist, I like in-text citations with a bibliography at the end. And this article made us do footnotes, which I hate. Traditional humanistic.
How pain in the dare you, sir?
Oh, they're a pain. They're a royal pain.
Oh, stop it! I like to be able to find my citation.
I also hate footnotes. I'm making all my students write footnotes.
Why do you guys hurt me so much? We've been talking for 2 hours, and now you're coming out to hurt me.
Right? Like it's like any great author.
Chicago style for life.
Yeah, I mean, I love author date. That's what I use. But I'm like, you have to be a historian. You got to learn your footnotes.
You listen, give me a good description. I want like a side quest. I want a whole story. I want a half-page footnote. Just and then this one time I found this and it was really cool. I'm like, you fucking nerd.
I love the footnotes where they just kind of throw shade at other scholars and other, it's like the little subtle footnote. Like you end up having these little subtle fights, and but all in good fun.
Is it always? Because sometimes I know
usually it's not.
Because in my film,
Jasmine's Day.
Thanks so much for those kind comments. Right, go ahead.
Yeah, Jasmine Day. So the mummy's case, and a lot of that applies to this theme again of in the case of Stargate. She has this nice description of how mummy plots play out in mummy films, and so it's again the transgression. You awaken the evil horror, and then either everybody dies. Or the heroes rally and are able to finally defeat the horror that threatens to destroy civilization itself. Right. And that's also the theme of the sort of Victorian Gothic of you unleash this horror that will come back to the metropole, the head of the empire, and destroy or take over the empire and corrupt it. So that one's a fun book and a fun read.
I'm realizing that we've gone so long now. My camera's gone completely out of focus over here. I'm like, did I take my contacts out?
What Julie and I were on anymore because she always runs 3 hours.
Oh my God! Just wait till we do Temple. Oh, wait till we do Last Crusade.
Or wait until we do Fifth Element. We will spend so much time going through every detail of that film.
Oh, such a good
one. You'll love it.
All right, last question. Is Stargate a history movie?
I say yes.
Yeah.
It's a history movie wrapped in science fiction. Mm-hmm. But still a history movie. And because in anybody else's hands, and Stuart's not paying me. and has no direct control.
I'm not paying Stuart. I want to make sure we're all clear. No one's paying anybody.
Yeah, no one's paying anybody. No one's getting paid here. But I really, truly think in somebody else's hands, this movie wouldn't have been as good. And I really do think it was the director and the writers, their vision. I think it was their dedication to finding a consultant, right, that could actually build that history. And then giving you and empowering you to serve, and the actors also buying in and like participating. And so, I know it's a group effort, but really, I think as you said, like you created music with ancient Egyptian language, that's something that doesn't exist in many other places. And to me, that's a history movie.
Yeah. I think it turned out as a really extraordinary film from that perspective. If you set aside the science fiction elements, but I still think it's good science fiction. And the space aliens, pyramids is the worst thing. But the rest of it, everything that James Spader says Egyptologically, I wrote. And that's the way they wanted it. So they would say, he needs to talk about this. And I would write a paragraph. And they would trim it down because it usually was too longer than they wanted because it's a movie. But then they wouldn't just trim it down and then go with it. They then brought it back to me and said, does this look okay? And I would say, yeah, sure. And they would go ahead with it. Or, and that's why I was on set so much is, they wanted to make a little change or a modification. They wanted some new dialogue. So I was there to do a translation, a vocalization, to create new Egyptology babble, if you will. So it's really solid. And then their instincts, there's so many touches in the film that I really had nothing to do with. That are really just excellent and resonate so well with Egyptian theology, like the Hathor thing, the symbol of the Eye of Re, and so on, and that queerness. The sun god Re is a queer figure. He transcends sex and sexuality and gender and everything else. There are overtones of Akhenaten as well. And actually, I'll throw out another book.
Yeah, the heads were kind of elongated and some.
Yeah, exactly.
And the side locks are, side locks that we see in Egyptian visual imagery of children. Like, there's so much there. So yes, it's a history movie, asterisk.
Yeah, exactly. But
obviously, it's a big science fiction component, but with the caveat that it's science fiction, it's a history movie.
Yeah.
Well, Julia said we're doing this movie. Like, I didn't really get a choice. I was like, okay. This has been, I'm sitting here, and I have to tell you, this is one of the real delights I have in hosting this pod. Getting to talk to two brilliant people about stuff that I have interested in, but is far beyond, my own expertise, and just getting to talk to you guys and listen to stuff. It's like, this has been the best freaking conversation. And I know we're wrapping up now, and this is a warning to our producer, Fletcher. This conversation could have gone another 2 hours.
You're welcome.
So easily.
We're being nice.
You're welcome, Fletcher. Right? This time. Wait till it's Fifth Element. We've exceeded the runtime of the film.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a checkmark for us.
There you go.
So, Stuart Tyson Smith, Julia Troche. Guys, thank you so much for being here tonight. This was a blast.
You're very welcome. I had a great time.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so much to our guests, Julia Troche and Stuart Tyson Smith. Guys, that was so much fun. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run, and to you guys for continuing to come in here. 100 episodes. You guys are crazy. Let's do another 100. Guys, keep supporting the pod. If you want to support the pod, you can go to patreon.com/Historians of the Movies, or you can keep sharing this pod on social media. Get this in front of new eyes. Share it with your friends, share it with your enemies, share it with everybody. Guys, thank you so much for being here. Ciao for now. Bye.